Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? Imagine it, Western Australia, an army armed with machine guns, and their adversary, over 20,000 emus. Post-World War I soldiers turned farmers faced a dire situation when emus began decimating their wheat crops. In a bizarre twist, the Australian government deployed military might to combat the feathered invaders. The emus, however, proved unexpectedly agile and resilient. Despite the soldiers' best efforts, the emus dodged bullets and scattered, rendering the campaign largely ineffective. The war ended in a humiliating defeat for the humans, leaving emus as the unchallenged victors and the soldiers to retreat in embarrassment. The event remains a surreal chapter in history, a sobering reminder of nature's unpredictability and resilience. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? It's a bizarre chapter in Australian history that sounds almost too absurd to be true. Following World War I, Australian farmers faced an unexpected adversary, thousands of emus that began invading wheat farms, causing significant crop damage. In a desperate attempt to curb the destruction, the government deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to wage war on the flightless birds. Despite their military might, the emus proved surprisingly resilient, outmaneuvering the soldiers and often escaping unscathed. The campaign became a comedic debacle, with the emus winning numerous skirmishes. Ultimately, the Great Emu War ended in defeat for the humans, highlighting the unpredictability of nature and the sometimes futile efforts of mankind against it. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? In a bizarre twist of history, Australia found itself embroiled in a conflict not against another nation, but against a formidable foe, the emu. After World War I, Australian soldiers were given land to farm, but when drought struck, emus seeking food descended upon these farms in droves. The government, desperate to protect the crops, deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to combat the flightless birds. The emus, however, proved to be unexpectedly agile and elusive, dodging bullets with surprising ease. After several weeks and thousands of rounds fired, the war ended with the emus emerging victorious. This peculiar episode remains a curious testament to the unpredictable challenges nature can pose, and the unanticipated resilience of wildlife against human intervention. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? In the arid landscapes of Western Australia, a peculiar conflict erupted that pitted soldiers against a flightless bird. Following World War I, Australian veterans were granted farmland, but an unexpected adversary emerged: tens of thousands of emus. These large, swift birds descended upon the crops, threatening the farmers' livelihoods. The government responded by sending soldiers armed with machine guns. The emus, however, proved to be surprisingly elusive and resilient. Despite their military efforts, the soldiers found themselves outwitted by the agile birds, leading to an embarrassing stalemate. This bizarre confrontation, where humans armed to the teeth were bested by emus, stands as a curious testament to nature's unpredictability and resilience. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? In a bizarre turn of events, the Australian government declared war on a flock of emus that were wreaking havoc on wheat crops in Western Australia. Armed with machine guns, soldiers were deployed to combat the flightless birds, believing it would be a swift victory. However, the emus proved to be more cunning than anticipated, evading bullets with surprising agility and even forming evasive groups. Despite multiple attempts over several weeks, the military efforts resulted in a comical and humiliating failure, with the emus largely unaffected and the soldiers ultimately retreating. The Great Emu War remains a quirky reminder of nature's unpredictability and the limits of human intervention. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? Picture this: Australia, post-World War I, grappling with an unexpected enemy, not human, but avian. Thousands of emus, driven by drought and hunger, invaded Western Australian farmlands, wreaking havoc on wheat crops. The government, desperate to protect its farmers, deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to combat the flightless birds. Yet, the emus proved surprisingly formidable. Their speed and erratic movements rendered the military's efforts almost comically ineffective. After weeks of futile skirmishes and dwindling ammunition, the operation was deemed a failure. The emus, it seemed, had outsmarted modern warfare, leaving behind a bizarre chapter in history that underscores the unpredictable power of nature. Have you ever heard about the Great Emu War of 1932? Picture this: Australia, post-World War I, where farmers are battling an unexpected and feathered enemy, emus. These large, flightless birds, in search of food during a drought, invade farmlands and devastate crops. The government responds by deploying soldiers armed with machine guns to combat the avian menace. Despite their military prowess, the emus proved to be elusive and surprisingly resilient, evading bullets and outmaneuvering the troops. The campaign turns into an absurd and costly debacle, with the emus emerging victorious, causing the government to eventually retreat and rethink their strategy. The Great Emu War remains a bizarre and fascinating chapter in history, highlighting the unpredictable and often humorous conflicts between humans and nature. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? This bizarre conflict saw soldiers armed with machine guns battling an unexpected and seemingly unstoppable enemy, emus. In Western Australia, the farming community was besieged by these large, flightless birds, which were destroying crops and livelihoods. Desperate, the government dispatched soldiers to combat the feathered invaders. But the emus proved surprisingly elusive, dodging bullets with remarkable agility. Despite the use of heavy artillery, the birds outmaneuvered the military, leading to an embarrassing defeat for the human forces. The Great Emu War remains a curious chapter in history where nature's unpredictability triumphed over human ingenuity, leaving a legacy of both humor and humility. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? It sounds like a joke, but it's a bizarre and true chapter in Australian history. Imagine soldiers, armed with machine guns, facing off against a formidable foe, 20,000 flightless birds. The emus, wreaking havoc on wheat crops in Western Australia, prompted the government to send in the military. Despite the soldiers' best efforts, the emus proved incredibly elusive, dodging bullets and regrouping quickly. The war lasted for several weeks, resulting in a resounding victory for the emus. The birds' incredible speed and agility outmatched the military tactics, and the operation was deemed a failure. The Great Emu War stands as a quirky testament to nature's unpredictability and the often absurd intersections between human endeavors and wildlife. Have you ever heard of the Great Emu War of 1932? Imagine a battlefield not filled with soldiers, but with a swarm of large, flightless birds. In the wake of the First World War, Australian farmers were facing an unprecedented invasion of emus, which were destroying their crops. In response, the government deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to combat these feathered foes. The emus, however, proved to be surprisingly elusive and resilient. The soldiers found it nearly impossible to hit the agile birds, and when they did, the emus often escaped unharmed. Despite multiple attempts and thousands of rounds of ammunition, the emus ultimately emerged victorious. The war ended in a humiliating defeat for the humans, marking one of the strangest and most unexpected outcomes in military history. It serves as a peculiar reminder of nature's unpredictable power and the limits of human control.